This video is brought to you by viewers like you. Thanks for letting me do this for so long. For a company that's only been around since the late 90s, Valve have had one hell of an impact on video game history. I worry that gamers these days only really know Valve from Steam, which has been undeniably successful for them in a way that is barely understandable anymore. But even though Valve aren't so keen on making new video games anymore, this is the shower I go to cry about that, their library of games that they've developed is so goddamn impressive that I'd be a large idiot if I didn't talk about them. So yeah, all the Valve games ranked from worst to best, and I want to know what you guys think is the best Valve game of all time. Trust me, there's a lot of best to choose from. Oh boy, so what do you reckon is the worst game that Valve have ever made? I don't know, they've been very experimental in the past, and you'd think that that would be their undoing, but they don't tend to miss very often despite the nature of a lot of their work. Counter-Strike Nexon Studio would have to go down as a miss though, a game that was co-developed with South Korean devs Nexon, which used to be called Counter-Strike Nexon Zombies, but underwent a rebrand to appeal to a wider demographic. It is bland as fuck, and feels like a knockoff Counter-Strike game that has had the name slapped on it to bring in more players, and the zombies being here just makes this game feel super generic. You can do so much better in just about every area. I gotta say, Counter-Strike Condition Zero isn't much better. It does have more Valve in it, with some co-developers along for the ride to help with an offline single player, which is kind of whatever. But the main issue here is that Condition Zero took a while to make. 4 years for an FPS sequel in the early 2000s is like 20 years for any other game. So by the time that Condition Zero came out, it already felt outdated since the competition had long since left it behind. It's kind of quaint to come back to like 2 decades later, but at the time it was kind of pointless. And speaking of pointless, we now have Artifact.
Are you serious?
For many people, this might be the worst thing that Valve have made, and there is for sure a good case to be made here. Artifact promised a lot as a collaboration between Valve and Richard Garfield from Magic the Gathering fame, and honestly, a digital collectible card game MOBA based on Dota 2, that should have gone a lot better. It is impressively put together, and you can tell that Valve worked hard on this because they were genuinely surprised when it met with a huge amount of fan backlash when the public realized just how pay-to-win Artifact really is. You gotta pump the funds into this to make it worth your time, and honestly, nah, I'm good. When was the last time you thought about Dota Underlords? It's an auto-battler mobile game that started life with a strong launch that Valve were fully supporting, and it was able to carve out a little niche for itself that Valve weren't really doing much with before Underlords came out. However, time is cruel and the years haven't been kind since Valve have released one too many botched updates for Underlords, and now it's horrendously unbalanced and a mere shadow of what it once was. If I made this ranking 4 years ago, we probably wouldn't have seen Dota Underlords so soon. Them's the breaks sometimes. Hey, so Alien Swarm was kind of okay, wasn't it? Definitely a game that Valve have forgotten by now since it came out in 2010 and it never got a sequel or anything, but it's a pretty fun co-op top-down shooter where you put bullets into aliens with some other friendlies, and it really does have a lot going for it as a more sci-fi, less first-person version of Left 4 Dead. Alien Swarm has an impressive community that has expanded the game into something incredible these days, but it didn't release with workshop support, and in fact was merely released to little fanfare 14 years ago up against industry heavyweights that it never had a chance with. So, that's a couple of points to Valve, but the rest to a community that continues to treat Alien Swarm with the respect it always deserved. Listen, it's not like I hate Counter-Strike, it's just that apart from the main game that everyone's played and heard of, there's just not all that much going on here. The original Counter-Strike is likely not a game that many modern fans have played and likely never given a second glance, but you can see it as a really basic, early version of the Counter-Strike you might know and love. It's very rough around the edges, and later games benefit a lot from refining the ideas that this game tries to put in place, but the original Counter-Strike does end up feeling like an unrefined mod for Half-Life, which is basically what it is. 1.6 is pretty damn good though. Aperture Desk Job was a weird idea that is only slightly less weird in practice. It's effectively a tutorial for the Steam Deck that throws you into the world of Aperture Science with the sultry tones of J.K. Simmons' Cave Johnson serenading you along the way. It's often a very basic experience, somewhat akin to a walking simulator except you're tethered to a desk for most of the game, and it doesn't have you solving the kind of puzzles that you perhaps expect from a Portal spin-off, but you know, it has its charm and quirky writing and a serious obsession with toilets, but it works for me. Didn't know J.K. Simmons was so good at opera. It's hard to describe, but Day of Defeat feels very nostalgic to me. I never played it growing up and I didn't fight in World War II either, but they just don't make team-based shooters from this time period anymore. Much like Counter-Strike, it started life as a mod for Half-Life 1 before being acquired by Valve and released as a full game years later, but I do like how transformative the final product is. It is grey and murky by design, but that does help with the World War II aesthetic, and when you throw in some clunky guns that take way too long to reload, it kinda comes together nicely as an alternative way to shoot people. I love that this game is still going strong all these years later. There's hope for us all. The best way I can describe Counter-Strike 2 is that Valve has some serious work to do here. Considering that CS2 was intended by Valve to replace Counter-Strike Global Offensive, they really should have been more careful with the state that the game was released in. There are a lot of new ideas to be excited for, but it seems like Valve were looking at Overwatch 2 with jealousy, since Counter-Strike 2 released with a tiny amount of content that has barely been added to since, including a bizarre starvation of new maps. It's also riddled up to the eyeballs of cheaters, so if you're new to Counter-Strike, you're not exactly going to stick around to learn how to play it properly when your opponents aren't even playing it properly. Oh no, Valve need to support a game that they've made. We're all fucked! Did you know that Valve is kind of fond of virtual reality? I know it's a crazy thought, but their first serious look into the tech came with The Lab in 2016. Like Aperture Desk Job, this is technically a spin-off of Portal since it exists in the same universe, but only kind of. I don't know, it's hard to nail this down for continuity's sake, but it's effectively a series of mini-games where you can mess around with VR and Valve's fancy physics engines. Some of these are as tech demo-y as you can possibly imagine, which leaves the multi-layered scan of a human body feeling a little bit strange and out of place, but I understand why it's here as a showcase of what VR can do for people. Gotta say, Zortex is pretty damn fun though. It is practically impossible to rank Team Fortress Classic by modern standards and in a video that features a lot of modern Valve games. You boot this baby up nowadays and you may struggle to see what all the fuss is about as you struggle to navigate outdated menus and some really ugly textures. Despite all of this, TFC is still unbelievably fun to play and still has a lot of the same qualities that carried forward so effectively to its more famous sequel. Large parts of it feel like they could have come from any one of Valve's other mostly brown and grey shooters, but everything surrounding the spy is still superbly executed. A little clunky for sure, but just the feign death mechanic on its own must have been mind-blowing in 1999, and it still makes me happy to this day. Put some respect on the name. It is my own personal theory that it is virtually impossible for two people to have experienced Counter-Strike Global Offensive in the same way. Some of that comes from it being a multiplayer online shooting experience that has some pretty competent mechanics that help it be undoubtedly fun to play. In a vacuum, CSGO can be tons of fun and was impressively enduring for a game that was 12 years old and still hugely influential and popular. My issues arise more so with what this game cultivates, since its community has long since been a breeding ground of abuse and hackers, which did make it a challenging game to approach this far down the line, and it's probably the only Valve game that is bogged down the most by microtransactions and gambling. The whole economy with knives and weapon skins kind of absorbed CSGO, to the point where inventories had to be migrated to Counter-Strike 2 because there were thousands of dollars in some of them. Also, yeah, obviously, you can't play this game anymore. Because it worked so well when Blizzard did it? 2006. A simpler time when the prospect of an episodic Half-Life game seemed more like a promise than an empty suggestion that ultimately led nowhere. Half-Life 2 Episode 1 is maybe a tad confusing if you're concerned with chronology and how it relates to Half-Life 2, the one without a subtitle, but it's episodic for a reason. Valve wanted to release Half-Life games more frequently, which led to Episode 1 releasing just 2 years after Half-Life 2, and a gap that small means that there isn't anything revolutionary going on here. It gave Valve enough time to improve Alex Vance's AI and improve some of the lighting, but mostly it's just the same amazing game that came out 2 years before. The only issue is that it's so short, but the episodic releases are intended to combat that. You know, while it lasted. Just to throw another multiplayer shooter into the mix, you might not know that Half-Life 2 originally didn't release with any kind of multiplayer component. This was, of course, a serious missed opportunity by Valve, so 2 weeks after Half-Life 2's release, Valve put out a separate retail release of Half-Life 2 Deathmatch. It's a fairly easy game to talk about since it's just Half-Life 2 but in a multiplayer setting where you can shoot fellow humans and even mess around with the gravity gun, so obviously it's really fun and amazing. Should I be a little disappointed in the lack of game modes beyond Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch? Yeah, probably, but I don't think I care. The people at Valve are good enough at their craft that they can make a co-op zombie shooter exciting, which recent years have taught me is hardly a formality. Left 4 Dead is such a wonderful blend of the gritty seriousness of a zombie apocalypse with the arcade-like personality of having just the best time shooting the undead with your friends. It's the sort of game that feels effortless, but clearly has so much going on just below the surface that you can't help but admire all the attention to detail and commitment to making these environments feel so lived in. The only snag is that it is so clearly designed towards co-op, and while you can definitely play in single player, it's just not quite the same experience. With friends it's an all-timer, but alone doesn't really work as well. Seeing how well part 1 of the trilogy went, Valve brought even more enthusiasm towards Episode 2. Again, the episodic release schedule meant that there's nothing too crazily different when compared to Half-Life 2 or 2.1 for that matter, but Episode 2 has these awesome open areas which feel like the perfect reaction to complaints that Episode 1 was too linear. It has a slight case of middle child since, while it is incredible, you can't quite shake the feeling that it's holding back a tad so that it can save something for Episode 3. It's more than the cliffhanger ending, although that is still agonizing. It's got the feel of something that has more to give, but it's saving it for a game that obviously never happens. The more you think about it, the more it hurts. I think this video has taught me that Valve made like 2 games and then the rest of their catalog is either offshoots or mods for other games that were repurposed into standalone releases. Defense of the Ancients 2, or just Dota 2, was commissioned by Valve as a modern reimagining of the original Warcraft 3 mod, and this went so well that it's been an industry giant pretty much non-stop for the last 11 years. MOBAs aren't exactly my preferred flavour of video game, but I can't ignore how enjoyably complex Dota 2 is, so that the skill ceiling is high enough to encourage its massive esports scene. Dota 2 also has one of the single best free-to-play models in the industry, with there being no need to spend a penny for better heroes or gear. And damn, actually good free-to-play models need preserving and celebrating because they're like fucking unicorns, I swear. It's not like Valve are missing out on any money here, Jesus. I'd have to think about it for a bit, but I think my favourite time shooting zombies in any game has to be Left 4 Dead 2. This is a strange sequel because the first game was actually rushed out, and instead of making small improvements, the wizards at Valve decided to make the sequel from scratch, which is really where the magic comes in. Yes, you've got the same eye for detail as the first game, but now you've got an extra helping of awesome level design, and new infected like the Charger and the Jockey, and a surprising focus on story. These campaigns didn't have much of a through line in Left 4 Dead 1, but now there's an overarching narrative that actually goes places and uses its colourful cast of characters really nicely. It's clearly more fun with friends and actually incredible with friends, but it still kinda works on your own. It's such a lightning in a bottle moment that some of the creators behind Left 4 Dead 2 tried to make it work again with Back 4 Blood a few years ago, and hey, it's okay, but you can tell the magic's missing. That juicy Valve magic. Take what you want from this statement, but for me, Portal 1 is the quintessential Valve game. It's number 6, so obviously I don't think it's the best, but I don't think many other studios out there were ever capable of making a game like Portal. First-person puzzle games were around before this game, but you would have struggled to find anything that had you thinking about the world around you as much as Portal. This game was somehow able to combine the deep, guttural feeling that my brain isn't as big or as impressive as it needs to be to solve these puzzles, with a sadness that portal gun technology doesn't exist in real life. GLaDOS is also one of the most compelling characters that Valve have ever written, and Portal 1 would be significantly worse off without her. Hell, I think the world would be a little darker without her. In a self-contained vacuum that exists circa 2014, Team Fortress 2 is one of the best gaming experiences of my life. A multiplayer shooter with so much charm and character and a specially curated approach to game balance that keeps each of its 9 characters feeling well integrated and yet hugely unique from one another. The hours I've poured into this thing over the years could have been spent on learning valuable life skills. Like, I could be fluent in another language with this kind of time. But instead, I spent them honing nasty air shots and perfecting my role as a sneaky Frenchman. However, the unfortunate reality of Team Fortress 2 is that this is the relative that is being kept barely alive by Valve on the tiniest amount of life support. The bill that leaves their bank every month that they don't even notice. TF2 hasn't just been neglected, it's been abandoned by Valve to the point that bots and hackers have sprung up like algae and moss on a stagnant pool, and I won't lie, it has soured how I look at this game now. All power to the Save TF2 movement, honestly. And what have Valve been doing in the meantime? Well, they casually dropped one of the best VR games ever made, which also acts as a shocking continuation to Half-Life continuity. So yeah, not much I suppose. Half-Life Alyx feels like a bit of a miracle for multiple reasons, but the main one is just how much work it does for convincing onlookers that VR is the future of video games. I have played way too many flashy tech demos that could easily be the definition of style over substance and have you questioning what advantages there are to VR over a standard control scheme. It's a lot of money, so what's the upside? Half-Life Alyx is an incredible upside that as you explore a familiar world of recognizable characters and landmarks, but with a perspective that completely changes how you interact with the world around you. Something as simple as reloading a gun is incredibly fun in VR, and Half-Life Alyx is able to spread this kind of enjoyable experience across the duration of a full-length video game. It is so good that it's worth getting into VR to experience it, and I don't think we've had that kind of game before this. I can honestly say that I never thought we'd ever get that kind of game. It's incredible to me that Valve have only been around for a couple of decades and yet have a catalogue as stacked as this, and you really notice how unbelievable these games are when you get to the very best of them. Portal 2 is such an astonishing triumph that any game studio would kill to have in their lineup. Not only for its ability to be a sequel to a game as unique as the first Portal, but because it expands on that game in ways that I don't think anyone thought was possible. The puzzles have been specially curated to push the boundaries of what you can do with 2 portals, with the new coloured gels adding a new layer of complexity that didn't feel all that plausible in the original. Portal 1 has a relatively simple story that was carried by GLaDOS, but here you've got a far more eventful narrative that is merely improved by some incredible voice acting performances. Throw in some really fun co-op and you've got one of the best games ever made, and yet somehow only third in this video. Yeah, we're dealing with some very high standards here, and I'd hazard a guess that basically no franchises have ever had a game as good as Half-Life 1 and then a sequel as good as Half-Life 2. Seriously though, amazing games exist of course, but the amount of those that are followed up with something as good if not better, it just doesn't happen all that often. If Valve were setting out to turn heads and uproot trees with Half-Life 1, their first ever video game by the way, it's safe to say they managed that. The one thing I don't like here is the alien homeworld at the end, although even then you've got all that low gravity which sweetened the deal a bit. Other than that, you've got one of the best single player shooters the world has ever seen, so tightly designed with fast paced action that you kinda wonder what the rest of the world was doing in the years before this. Even now, 26 years later, Half-Life 1 still holds up shockingly well, and is perfectly competent at giving you a thrilling adventure all these years down the road. You can tell why every other Valve game is based off of Half-Life. Which is a good enough time to remind everyone that the orange box is a bundle that contains many of the games we've talked about to this point, and also the best game that Valve have ever made, and is therefore some of the best value that has ever been put onto a gaming storefront. The easiest way I can talk about Half-Life 2 is that it's everything that Half-Life 1 was for the industry, but about 6 years later, and with a kind of precognition that is usually reserved for fortune tellers and witches. Gotta strap this thing to a stake and burn it. It burst onto the scene in 2004 and told the world exactly what FPS campaigns should be like for the next 15 years, which on its own would be an unbelievable legacy, but Valve were cooking with more on this one. The gravity gun is one of the most entertaining weapons ever put into a video game, and also such a casual flex of the Source engine that turns every object into a really fun projectile. So it's this incredible look into the future that still feels relevant these days, since the future is currently the now, but it also has the tools and the scenarios to let you play around with its physics engine. It takes itself seriously, and yet you're encouraged to mess around and have fun. It's like the best of all worlds. And yeah, those are my rankings for all the Valve games. Do you agree, or is there something else you'd have at number 1? Let me know in a comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future, and hit that bell for notifications of every new upload. The last video I made was about moments that go hard in video games, make sure you go watch that, and I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Sarah Mallion, the Green Scorpion, and Scott Riker. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.